Please forgive my mediocre pronunciation. French is not my forte. Hello everyone, I hope that you're doing well. My name is Emily and I would like to welcome you to a brand new series that I am calling If the Slipper Fits. So one thing about me is that I love Cinderella. I love Disney's Cinderella and I have a lot of nostalgia and personal attachment for it. And I also just love the Cinderella fairy tale in general. So finding different versions and adaptations of the Cinderella tale that are out there has become a bit of a fascination of mine. So I figured since it's something I'm passionate about, why not turn that into a video series? And with this series, I want to do the best that I feasibly can to review and discuss any and every version of the Cinderella tale available. I'm talking books, movie, TV, games, music, stage performances. Nothing is off limits here. Though when you're dealing with a story as ubiquitous as Cinderella and there's so many iterations out there, where on earth do you even start? Well, to me, it seems the best place to start is not at the very beginning, despite what Maria von Trapp tells us, but with Charles Perrault. Perrault was a French author and academic who lived throughout most of the 17th century and published several fairy tales that are still relevant in popular culture today. Cinderella, obviously, but also Little Red Riding Hood, Sleeping Beauty, and Puss in Boots, just to name a few. Now, it's important to note that Perrault did not actually create these stories, but rather wrote up and published his versions of folk tales that had been passed down throughout France and wider Europe. And because we can't exactly date something until someone writes it down, there's no one easy way to tell how long these folk tales were around prior to that writing. Perrault wasn't even the first writer to do this sort of thing, as we will discuss in a later episode. However, Perrault's version seems to be the one that most modern adaptations tend to take their inspiration from. If you're watching a Cinderella movie, there is an excellent chance that you will see based on the story by Charles Perrault in the credits. So it's not exactly point zero, but for our purposes, it's a very good jumping off point. Also, since Perrault was French, in order for the story to make it over to the English-speaking West, where I am, it had to be translated. Now, I am not about to get into the whole minutia of studying translated works. That is a whole other can of worms. You can look into it on your own time. I'm not going to do it here. Initially, I was just going to talk about this book that I picked up from my local library, Charles Perrault, The Complete Fairy Tales, published by Oxford University Press. It looked pretty respectable, and I was just going to call this a day. However, I nearly forgot that the version of Cinderella that is in the Blue Fairy book, which I happen to have a copy of, is Perrault's version. So I did wind up with two different translations of this thing. Now, the Blue Fairy book, being much older, first published in 1889, doesn't come with a lot of details when it comes to its sources. You can see that Andrew Lang just credits the whole story of Cinderella to Charles Perrault and then leaves. He doesn't give any notes about who translated it or anything. The Oxford book is a different story. This one was published in 2009 and translated by Christopher Betts. And not only does he include notes in the back here on particular translation choices that he made or the cultural context of a line, but also an appendix that briefly talks about alternate versions of the different tales for further reading. When I said that this was a great jumping off point, I did not realize how right I was. Now, I've read both translations and they are basically the same, save for a couple of interesting word choices here and there, and I will mention those when they come up. But with 120 years between these two, I think it's safe to say that actively searching out other translations of this work is a bit of a moot point. I could always be proven wrong though. So with all of that out of the way, let's actually jump into this thing. I'm going to start by briefly going over the events of the story just so that we're all on the same page, and then we will come back later and discuss the details. We open with a description of the family. A widowed gentleman, his haughty second wife, and her two daughters who are very similar to her, and the gentleman's daughter from his first marriage who is very kind. The stepmother does not take well to the gentleman's daughter because her good behavior makes her own daughters look worse, so she forces her into doing the household chores and sleeping in the attic. The girl takes this behavior without complaining to her father. Because she spends time around the fireplace, her stepsisters take to calling her nicknames, which is how she's referred through the rest of the story as Cinderella. The prince of the land announces that he is giving a ball, and the stepsisters are invited to go. Cinderella helps them get dressed and acts like she's fine with not going to the ball herself, but deep down she actually wants to. Once they leave, Cinderella's godmother appears, noticing that she is upset, and says that she will help her go to the ball. She transforms a pumpkin into a coach, mice into horses, a rat into a coachman, and lizards into footmen. She then turns Cinderella's ragged clothes into a beautiful dress and gives her a pair of slippers made of glass. Before she leaves, the godmother warns Cinderella that everything will transform back into what it was at midnight, so she shouldn't stay out past then. Cinderella is taken for a princess when she arrives at the ball, and everyone is amazed at how beautiful she is. The prince is particularly entranced by her, dancing and dining with her the whole evening. Even her stepsisters don't recognize her. She leaves quickly before midnight, but once she's back home, she reveals to her godmother that the prince asked her to attend the ball again the next night. Her stepsisters also tell her about the beautiful princess once they return home. She goes to the ball the next night in the same way, but she loses track of time and ends up leaving the ball just at midnight. She also loses one of her glass slippers, which is picked up by the prince. Once she returns home, she realizes even though she no longer has her dress or her coach, she still has the other glass slipper. Her stepsisters tell her that the prince must be in love with the princess who ran off. The prince then makes the announcement that he will marry the person whose foot fits the slipper that was left behind. They start with ladies of nobility, but when none of them are a match, they expand their search. The slipper is tried on the stepsisters, but they can't make it fit. Then Cinderella asks if she can try it on, and it fits her perfectly. That's when she reveals that she has the matching slipper. The godmother shows up again, transforming Cinderella's clothes again into something beautiful. The stepsisters recognize her and they ask for forgiveness for how they've treated her. Cinderella does forgive them, and they end up living in the palace, married to lords of the court. Cinderella herself marries the prince, and by all accounts, lives happily ever after. Now, most of the tales that Perrault is known for were published in a collection called Stories or Tales of Bygone Times with Their Morals. And at the end of each tale is a short little poem describing the moral to be taken away. Sometimes more than one. Like, we can't trust the silly reader to understand what these stories mean, so we're just going to tell them point blank. And I am of the belief that you, just by virtue of being the reader, have brought something to the story, and whatever you end up taking away from it is valid. So the author just shoving his intent down your throat at the end of the story does rub me the wrong way a little bit, especially when the morals make no sense. Like the one for Sleeping Beauty basically boils down to young girls just aren't patient to find love anymore and there's nothing that we can do about it, which has absolutely nothing to do with the actual story. Are you just calling her patient because she slept for 100 years before her love interest came along? Because I wouldn't necessarily call that patience, I would call that being cursed, which honestly is more the fault of people keeping her ignorant of the situation rather than actually telling her what the heck is going on. Sorry, different story. Back on track. Cinderella is one of these that has more than one moral. The first one explains that Cinderella didn't necessarily win the prince's heart because she had the nice dress and all the rest of it, but that she was actually kind and pleasant to talk to, and that these should be characteristics that you aim for when you eventually go hunting for a man. The second goes to say that you can certainly be blessed with wonderful gifts of character, but it's also important to know how to use them, and that it's beneficial to learn from a mentor figure. The poem specifically mentions a godfather or godmother, and Betts actually has a note back here, a practical suggestion rather than a facetious comment on the story. Wealthy and influential friends or relatives were often asked to fulfill the role in the expectation that their sponsorship would be of value to the child in later life. Complete side note, but I do know that this was also a popular practice in the Regency era to try and help your child have better connections, i.e. marriage opportunities. And God, now all I want is for someone to write a Jane Austen-inspired Cinderella story. Can you imagine the romance? Please, somebody make this happen. Now, I bring up all of this moral business not just to rant, but because there is a brief mention of Cinderella's mother at the beginning of the story, and it says that she was very charming and that all of this goodness that Cinderella possesses, she got from her mother. But because the description is so brief, it's not clear whether these traits are inherited or whether they were actually taught to her by her mother. We're not even given any clue as to when Cinderella's mother actually died or how long her father and her stepmother have been married. And to me, that sort of omission kind of conflicts with the second moral of you need to learn from your betters how to behave. Because even the godmother doesn't necessarily teach her anything. She just shows up, sees that Cinderella is upset and wants to go to the ball, and then gives her a dress and transportation so that she can go. It's not like we have this montage of the godmother going all Henry Higgins on Cinderella and making sure that she knows how to behave in polite society. I will give points to Perrault where due, however. In the second moral, he mentions good breeding, which, courage, sense, a ready wit, and other things of comparable worth. These are the characteristics that he is telling the audience at large will take them far in life, that these are what we should strive for. I would also argue that courageous and intelligent aren't necessarily how the general population might jump to describe Cinderella, and yet that's exactly what Perrault is doing. This guy, he's onto something. One of the biggest things that stands out to me in terms of how this version compares to future adaptations is how small of a role the stepmother plays. She's literally never mentioned again after the first page, and the stepsisters are treated as the main antagonists. It's never even stated that the stepmother ends up going to the ball with her daughters. Yet there are so many popular adaptations where the stepmother is treated as the true villain, and the stepsisters are more or less her lackeys. Her role here isn't insignificant, it just gets lumped in with the backstory more than anything. She is the one to be cruel to Cinderella first, and then the stepsisters just follow suit because they are so similar to their mother. You also might not have noticed a mention of Cinderella's father's death in this version. That's because there isn't one. Like the stepmother, he is never mentioned again after the first page, but he is still alive through Cinderella's terrible treatment because the writing notes how she chooses not to complain to him about it. In the Betts translation, he phrases it as the father being under the thumb of the stepmother, and the Lang version phrases it as for his wife governed him entirely. So I think from both of these, we can interpret that his relationship with the stepmother wasn't exactly copacetic, but also whether or not the father was entirely aware of the power that the stepmother had over him could also be up for debate. Interestingly, it specifies that only the younger stepsister actually calls her Cinderella due to her being not as rude as her older sister. And the older sister will actually refer to her as Cinder Bum or Cinder Wench, depending on the translation. So even though it's small, we do already have a seed being planted of one of the stepsisters being more worthy of redemption than the other, which is also a quite popular trope in other adaptations. Also, one of the stepsisters gets a name, which I was not expecting, but only the eldest one, which feels very unfair. Depending on the translation, she is either Javotte or Charlotte. It also mentions that even though the stepsisters treat her horribly, they still think Cinderella has good taste, and they genuinely want her opinion on what they're wearing to the ball. Okay, I know that a level of suspension of disbelief is required to read fairy tales, and sometimes things just happen and there's no lore to explain it or anything, and you just have to live with it. That I get. But the fairy godmother, though, it doesn't even say how she got to the house in the first place. Like, she just shows up out of nowhere. And not even necessarily in like a cute poof magic way, but in like a creepy way, honestly. Her godmother saw that she was all in tears and asked what the matter was. That is literally the first mention of this woman that we get in this story. And it just slips in the fact that she's a fairy like it's the most nonchalant thing in the world.
Her godmother, who happened to have red hair. Her godmother, who happened to play bingo on the weekends. Her godmother, who happened to be a fairy.
And there is no mention if she and Cinderella have even interacted before, if this is the first time that she's shown up. If it is the first time, then Cinderella is being surprisingly chill about the whole thing. She's just like, oh, you need a rat to transform into a coachman? I'll go trap one for you. I need context, y'all. Moving on to the ball, of which there are two. I was actually surprised. Most of the time when the story gets retold, it just gets trimmed down to one ball, the ball, if you will. And I know that there's other versions that have 3 balls because fairy tales like to do everything in 3s. So to just have it happen twice feels weirdly off, and it bothers me way more than I thought it would. It's also unclear whether having 2 balls was always the plan, or if the prince just decided to let it go on for another night because he wanted to see Cinderella again. However, apparently the prince waits a few days between that second ball and starting the whole slipper fitting montage, which, as the kids say, kind of feels like he left her on red for a while. Both of the prince's parents are alive, by the way. I know not all, but some adaptations like to kill off one of the prince's parents, but they are both alive here. There's actually a really funny line when Cinderella first gets there. Even the king, old though he was, could not stop looking at her and said quietly to the queen that it was a long time since he had seen so beautiful and charming a girl. Which, yes, this is just going on about how well Cinderella is being received, but also that's kind of a jerk thing to say to your wife. Also, not only does Cinderella actively sit next to her stepsisters at the ball, implying that she is not concerned whatsoever about them recognizing her, but she even shares the citrus fruits that they get at dinner, which apparently were an expensive luxury at the time. And this is a really important point because earlier when Cinderella is helping her stepsisters get ready for the ball, the story makes a point to mention how anybody else would have styled their hair horribly for how mean they had been. But Cinderella is so good that she helps them style it as well as she can. And even while she's doing all of these things, she never expects the stepsisters to be magically nice to her in return. And some could argue that she's naive, but it's deeper than that. Something about her actively chooses not to be cruel to people who are being cruel to her. She takes the high road every time. She does not allow these people and the cruel way that they move through the world to affect how she behaves. And given the situation that she's in, that undoubtedly takes an incredible amount of mental and emotional strength. And to me, that is so much of what the spirit of the Cinderella fairy tale embodies, that strength and kindness don't have to be mutually exclusive. I really didn't mean to get all have courage and be kind on y'all yet, but the evidence is there. So overall, I think that there is a reason why people keep reaching for this one as a source text. It's very straightforward, yes, but there's just a spirit and a wholesomeness in here that just really embodies why we've been captivated by this story for as long as we have and continue to be. All things considered, I think Mr. Perrault did pretty darn okay. Thank you so much for joining me on the maiden voyage of this new series. I hope you enjoyed it and it sounds like something that you might be interested in. And of course, if it does, you can always subscribe to the channel so that you can be notified when I put out a new episode. And you can also show your support for this video by giving it a like. And I already have a lot of things that I want to cover on this series, but if you have a suggestion for something that I should check out, definitely leave me a comment and I will be sure it gets added to the list. But for now, I think I'm about ready to turn into a pumpkin, so I will see you next time. Bye!